Good evening. Good evening. My name is John Ritchie, and I'm a junior biology major from Westfield, Indiana, and it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the founder, chairman, and chief legal counsel of Children's Health Defense, founder of Waterkeeper Alliance, and of counsel at Morgan & Morgan, a nationwide personal injury practice. He earned a BA from Harvard University, a JD from the University of Virginia School of Law, and an LLM from the Pace University School of Law. He also studied at the London School of Economics. A recipient of numerous awards, including the Stroud Award for Freshwater Excellence and the Theodore Gordon Fly Fishers Conservation Award, Mr. Kennedy has practiced law for nearly 4 decades, working on environmental initiatives and defending victims of government and corporate corruption and abuse. He is the author of numerous books, including American Values, Lessons That I Learned from My Family, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health, and forthcoming, The Wuhan Cover-Up, How U.S. Officials Conspired with the Chinese Military to Hide the Origins of COVID-19. Please join me in welcoming Robert F. Kennedy, Jr.
Thank you. I'm very, very happy to be here. Can you hear me? If you can't hear me, raise your hand. I'm really happy to be here. Although I've never been here before, it feels like almost like a homecoming because of the incredible role that this institution played during COVID-19, where it was the only college left in the country that really stood up for freedom. And, you know, when this college was established in 1844, abolitionists were despised by the vast majority, 90% of the people in our country hated them and thought they were crazy and that they, that they were unrealistic. And it wasn't really until 3 years into the Civil War that it flipped, and that the president came out and freed the slaves, and he couldn't do it because the public antipathy for abolitionism. So it's really this institution has an extraordinary history, and it's been very, very faithful to the values upon which it was established, which is this love of freedom, no matter what public opinion, no matter what the public cost, no matter who pressures you to stop, to stand up for it. And it's really a testimony to something special. And the investment that has been made here, not in building a pile, teaching students to build a pile for themselves like most colleges, and whoever dies with the most stuff wins, but instead building character and demonstrating character. And, thank you. Somebody last night asked me about how I got into the anti-vax racket, and which I'm not anti-vaccine, although I'm kind of the poster child for the anti-vax movement. But I've been an environmental attorney for now 40 years. Up until 2005, that's all I did. And then that year, I ran a group called Hudson River Keeper, which I represented for 40 years, commercial fishermen on the Hudson and recreational fishermen, suing polluters who were destroying their livelihoods, their property values, their communities. And they had a business model. We have the oldest commercial fishery in the country on the Hudson. The people I represented for 40 years, many of them came from families that have been fishing the river continuously since Dutch colonial times. It's a traditional gear fishery. They use the same fishing methods that were taught by the Algonquin Indians, the original Dutch settlers of New Amsterdam, and then passed down through the generations. And they had a business model that worked for 3 centuries. And then they were put out of business by polluters who had political clout and who were able to manipulate government agencies, capture and manipulate government agencies in order to escape the discipline of the free market and force the public to pay their production costs. And they had turned the Hudson Valley into kind of a not free market capitalism, but corporate crony capitalism and this corporate kleptocracy, which really is about socialism for the rich and a very savage and brutal and merciless brand of capitalism for the poor. And they saw this happening. And, you know, I fought for them for 40 years, but in 2000, we were successful. I brought over 300 successful lawsuits on the Hudson. By the year 2000, we had forced polluters to spend $3.5 billion remediating the river. The river, when I started working there, caught fire. It turned colors, depending on what color. They were painting the trucks at the GM plant in Tarrytown. It was dead water, 0 dissolved oxygen for 20 miles north of the city, 20 miles south. Today, it is an international model for ecosystem protection. It's the richest waterway in the North Atlantic. It produces more pounds of fish per acre, more biomass per gallon than any other waterway in the Atlantic Ocean north of the equator. It's the last major river system left in the Atlantic that still has strong spawning stocks of all of its historical species of migratory fish. And the miraculous resurrection of the Hudson inspired river keepers on waterways all over the world. We became the biggest water protection group in the world. We have 350 water keepers. Each one has a patrol boat. They each patrol a local waterway, and they litigate against polluters. We're a law enforcement organization. We have great environmental laws, but because of agency capture, they're almost never enforced. And so, but we're allowed to enforce them under, a provision called the citizen supervision. In 2003, the National Academy of Sciences published a report that showed that every freshwater fish in North America, 10-year study, was contaminated with dangerous levels of mercury. And so the water keepers who represent fishermen were particularly, this seemed to us like we were living in a science fiction nightmare, where my children, the children of every other American, could now no longer engage in the seminal primal activity of American youth, which is to go fishing in the local waterway and then come home and safely eat the fish. And those companies had privatized the public commons, a resource that is owned by the public. To make profits for themselves, they had privatized. We no longer own the fish. The companies who are doing that polluter, which is coal-burning power plants and cement kilns primarily. So in 2005, we started suing them. A lot of people were suing coal plants, but we were suing them. The water keepers were suing them on mercury. And I had 40 suits going by 2005. And I was traveling all around the country talking to crowds like this about mercury. And at almost every speech I gave, these groups of women, and they were different at every place, would come and sit in the front row before they'd show up early. And then when I finished, they'd wait and they'd ask to talk to me. And as it turns out, all of them were the mothers of intellectually disabled children. And they all believed that the vaccines had caused their child's injury, particularly mercury vaccines. And they would say to me in a very respectful but also kind of vaguely scolding way, if you're really interested in mercury exposures to children, you need to look at vaccines. I didn't want to do it. I had spent a lot of my life working on the issues of intellectual disabilities. It was part of the DNA of my family. My Aunt Eunice, who was also my godmother, started Special Olympics. I had been working in Special Olympics, which was then called Camp Shriver, since I was 8 years old. Every weekend, as a hugger, as a coach, I spent 200 hours as a teenager in high school working in Wasaic Home for the Retarded. My family, my uncle was chair of the health committee for 50 years. My family wrote a lot of the legislation that gave rights and changed the entire relationship with individuals with intellectual disabilities, the most vulnerable population in the country. But I didn't want to do that for my life. I wanted to work on fisheries, on water pollution, on energy. And so I was dodging these ladies. And then one of them came to my house, found my house on Cape Cod in the summer of 2005. She was a psychologist from Minnesota named Sarah Bridges. She had a son who got severe autism from a mercury vaccine. He had gotten a $20 million award from the vaccine court, which recognizes autism came from the vaccine. There was no controversy, and she didn't want it to happen to other children. And she showed up at my house, and she took out of the trunk of her car a stack of studies about 18 inches deep. She put it on my front stoop, then she knocked on the door. And when I came to the door, she pointed to the pile, and she said, "I'm not leaving here till you read those." And I'm accustomed to reading science. I wanted to be a scientist when I was a kid, and the kind of law that I practice involves a lot of science. So almost every suit that I brought has involved some kind of scientific controversy. And I would not be very good at my job if I didn't enjoy reading science and if I could not read it critically. And so I sat down, and I didn't read the studies, but I read the abstracts. And I got about 6 inches down on that pile, and I was just dumbstruck by this huge delta between what the public health agencies were saying the science said and what the actual peer-reviewed published science was saying. And I started after that doing what I always did when I didn't understand something. I had, because of my name and my family's relationships with these agencies, I could always get the head of an agency on a phone very quickly. And I started calling them and asking questions. I got Francis Collins from NIH and Kathleen Stratton and Marie McCormick from Institute of Medicine. And they told me something weird. I asked them about the science, and I realized they were completely not conversant with it. They were just parroting this phrase, safe and effective. They hadn't read any of the actual science. And when I asked them about details, they said, "You have to talk to Paul Offit." Well, Paul Offit is a vaccine developer who's a partner of Merck's. And, I had been working with EPA for many years, suing about probably 20% of my lawsuits were against EPA, which is a captive agency, but captive by the oil and chemical and pesticide industries. And, EPA, if I call a science guy or a regulator there, they're going to have some self-respect. And they're going to try to answer my question. They're not going to direct me to a coal industry lobbyist. So this was bizarre. And then when I talked to Paul Offit, I caught him in a lie, and which I'm not going to go into. I'd love to go into, but I'm going to. I need to conserve my time here, so take my word for it. But he knew I caught him in a lie. I knew, and there was that moment where we're like, "You are just a liar," and so then I realized, okay, these guys either don't know what they're doing or they're lying about it deliberately. And then I realized these agencies were completely captured, but agency capture on steroids. FDA gets more than 50% of its budget from the pharmaceutical companies. CDC has a $12 billion budget, and $5 billion of that, so almost half, goes to buying vaccines from these companies and then distribute them. So if you work at CDC, you do not get promotions by finding problems with vaccines. You get promoted by increasing uptake. And then NIH is just an incubator for pharmaceutical products. So it develops the vaccines, hands them over to the industry, hands them over to the universities, which then get NIH money, $200, $300 million to do phase 2 and phase 1 and phase 2 trials. Then if those are successful, which they always are because they make them successful, they then call in the pharmaceutical company to do a phase 3, and then they all divide up the royalty, the patent margin rights, and then they all go, then Tony Fauci, who's the head of NIH, walks it through the regulatory process at FDA and CDC, where he's picked the members of the panels who are all taking money from him. And they know their product is next in line, and their job is to rubber stamp this product and recommend it to children. So I saw this process and how it worked. And it's beyond, it was regulatory capture on steroids. It was like, and then NIH gets the money. I got deplatformed for saying NIH owns half this the Moderna vaccine. They said that's vaccine misinformation. Well, guess what? On Thursday this week, Moderna made a $400 million payment to NIH for its share of the royalties to date. So, all of my conspiracy theories have about a 3-month shelf life before they become reality. And then what I realized, I do this very quickly, I saw what had happened in the vaccine program. And when I was a kid, I got 3 vaccines, and I was compliant. But my kids, I have 7 kids, they got 72 vaccines, and they're all mandated. In California, you can't get out of it. And how did that happen? It happened because Ronald Reagan signed the Vaccine Act. What happened is in 1979, they started using a DTP vaccine, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis, which is now illegal in Europe and the United States. Bill Gates gives it to 161 million African kids a year. But it was killing or doing permanent brain damage to 1 in every 300 kids, according to an NIH study, commissioned study at UCLA. So this was devastating. So we got rid of it, and we switched it with another attenuated version of the vaccine that is less dangerous and less effective. But Wyeth, which made it, which is now called Pfizer, went to Reagan and said, we're paying $20 in downstream liability for every dollar that we make in profits. And we're going to get out of the vaccine business altogether unless you give us full immunity from liability. And Reagan said, why don't you make the vaccine safe? And they said, because vaccines are unavoidably unsafe. And that phrase is in the preamble of the statute. So when people tell you it's safe and effective, the statute that they're relying on says they're unavoidably unsafe. And the Brucewitz versus Wyeth case, which is the Supreme Court case that upheld that statute, has the same phrase in it. So as soon as he did that, now they have this liability shield. So no matter how negligent they are, no matter how reckless they are, no matter how grievous your injury, no matter how toxic and unnecessary the product, no matter how unnecessary and ineffective the vaccine, you cannot sue them. And of course, these are the companies that are not good companies. These are the same companies that gave us the opioid epidemic that now kills more, 68,000 kids in this country every year, more than the Vietnam War did in 20 years. And they knew it. And if you look at that Netflix documentary, Dope Sick, it shows exactly how they did it, because the FDA was totally corrupted by this industry and did whatever they said. And so this is the industry. What happens when you go to that industry and you say, now, no matter what you do, by the way, the 4 companies that make all of our vaccines have paid $35 billion in criminal penalties in the last 10 years. These are criminal enterprises. Criminality, there are serial felons, every one of them. So why do you think, if you remove any chance they'll ever get caught, that they're suddenly going to find Jesus and say, yeah, because in my political party, everybody knows, the Democrats, everybody knows the vaccine, the pharmaceutical companies are just the worst, most corrupt company that there are. But when it comes to vaccines, they're not corrupt. And it's this weird cognitive dissonance. So then what happened is you had these companies that now are absolved from the biggest cost of every medicine, which is downstream liability. Then they're absolved from something else. Vaccines are the only medical product that never has to do pre-licensing safety studies. So not one, and this is an artifact of CDC's legacy as the public health service, which is part of the uniformed military services. And the public health service launched the vaccine program as a national security defense against biological attacks on our country. So they wanted to make sure that if the Russians attacked us with anthrax or some other biological agent, we could quickly formulate a vaccine and then deploy it to 200 million Americans with no regulatory impediments. Because they said, if we call it a medicine, we're going to have to test it for safety. That takes 5 years, because a lot of the injuries from medical products have long diagnostic horizons or long incubation periods. You don't see them for 5 years. And you could be saving 10,000 lives from diphtheria and killing 100,000 people from cancer 5 years later. You want to find out if that's true. But they said, we don't have time to do that. So we're going to call them biologics, and we will exempt biologics from any safety testing. So for many years, I was saying not one of the 72 vaccines mandated for children has ever been safety tested in pre-licensing placebo-controlled trials, not one. Tony Fauci was saying he's lying. In 2016, President Trump appointed me to run a vaccine safety commission. And he ordered Fauci and Collins to meet with me with White House counsel, present. And I said to Fauci at that meeting, you say I'm lying. For 8 years, you've been saying I'm lying about this. Show me the study. And at that point, he made this show of going through, a lawyer's read well, like he was looking for a study. And he said, I don't have it here. It's back in Bethesda. And I'll send it to you. I never got it. So I sued him. Me and Aaron Siri, and after stonewalling us for a year, their lawyers met us on the courthouse steps and said, yep, you're right, we never had any study. And they gave it to us in writing. You can go to the CHD website, my website, and you can see that letter from HHS. So they don't have to do, there's no downstream liability, there's no front-end safety testing. That saves them $250 million. And there's no marketing and advertising costs, because the federal government is ordering them ordering 78 million school kids to take that vaccine every year. What better product could you have? And so there was a gold rush to add all these new vaccines to the schedule that we don't need. Why would you give a hepatitis B vaccine to a baby? The only way you get hepatitis B, you can get it from the mother, but every mother's tested in the hospital. Every mother who goes in the hospital is tested, so you know. You give it to those kids, okay. But the only way that you get it is from sleeping with a prostitute, unprotected sex, or male promiscuity, or from sharing needles with somebody who's got it. Well, the little baby gets it on the first day of life. He's not going to do any of that stuff. So why do they do it? I'll tell you why. Because Fauci told Merck to make the vaccine. Fauci helped make it, develop it. Merck made it, and they said, we're going to sell it to prostitutes and to male homosexuals. Merck came back a year later and says, none of these guys want it. They got other things they want to spend their money on, and they're not people who are really concerned with health, by the way. So the CDC and FDA said, don't worry. They said, we put all this money, Merck said, we put all the money into infrastructure, and now nobody's buying it. And so they said, okay, we'll mandate it for children. That's why these kids have to get hepatitis B vaccines. The entire safety testing for Merck's hepatitis B vaccine, 4 days. Oh, it's criminal. And most of these vaccines are unnecessary. Many of them are for diseases that are not even casually contagious. It was a gold rush, because if you get onto that schedule, the recommended schedule, it's $1 billion a year for your company. And in many cases, NIH is sharing the royalties. So we got all of these new vaccines, 72 shots, 16 vaccines, and now even more because we're doing the HPV vaccine. And that year, 1989, we saw an explosion in chronic disease in American children. Any of you who are my age, I'm going to name some of the diseases that are most common. You think about it, whether if you're my age, I'm 69. I had 11 brothers and sisters, 70 cousins, and I never saw any of these diseases. I never knew a kid with a peanut allergy. And why do 5 of my kids have food allergies? Well, their asthma was around, but it was rare. My brother has asthma. His doctor said there'll never be a cure for these diseases because it's too rare, nobody ever studies it. Now 1 out of every 4 black children has asthma. The neurological diseases suddenly exploded in 1989. ADD, ADHD, sleep disorders, language delays, ASD, autism, Tourette syndrome, tics, narcolepsy. These are all things that I never heard of. Autism went from 1 in 10,000 in my generation, according to the CDC data, to 1 in every 34 kids today, 1 in every 22 boys. And some of these kids, in severe autism, I've never seen anybody my age with severe autism, severe, real, full-blown autism. That means stimming, head banging, toe walking, nonverbal, non-toilet trained. Where are these people? Why don't you see them in the malls? Because they didn't exist then. And they're not locked up anywhere because there's no place to put them. But 1 in 34 kids has it. About half of them look like that. These are kids that'll never hit a baseball. They'll never pay taxes. They'll never vote. They'll never write a poem. These are kids who many of them will never sit on a toilet unassisted. They'll never go out on a date. We did this to a generation of kids. Those are the neurological disorders, autoimmune diseases. I never knew anybody with juvenile diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, 170 autoimmune diseases that have now exploded. Congress said to EPA, tell us what year the autism epidemic began. And the EPA is captured, but not by pharma. So it actually did some science. And it said 1989, it's a red line. That's the year. Now, it could be let me get into that in a minute. And then the last category is allergic diseases. There's food allergies, peanut allergies, anaphylaxis. I've never heard of eczema. Now you go into every classroom. And anaphylaxis. By the way, so many of my kids had food allergies that I helped found the Food Allergy Initiative. We raised, and a guy I was suing constantly, David Koch, was my partner starting this thing. So he had a kid the same age as mine who was anaphylaxis. We brought $200 million. We brought all these doctors up and scientists. We created a lab. What I found out is these scientists, the way they study food allergies, is they give rats allergies. They induce some allergies in the rat. And then they study it. How do you induce an allergy in a rat? You give them the aluminum adjuvant from the hepatitis B vaccine along with the protein. So if you give him a peanut protein, he now has peanut allergies. If you give him a latex protein, he now has latex allergies. If you give him a dairy protein, he now has dairy allergies. That's how they give it to him. Well, and then not only is it the protein doesn't have to be in the syringe, and a lot of our vaccines have peanut oil excipients, so it's not. It's no mystery where the peanut allergies are coming from. But also, if there's something in the ambient in the environment at the time, like if there's a Timothy weed outbreak, that kid now is going to have a lifetime allergy to Timothy weed. That's why vaccinated children, this is 2 studies by Cowlings and Mawson, have 30 times the rate of allergic rhinitis as unvaccinated children. They're sick all the time. Am I out of time or something? No, I'm just going to fix the mic. What? I'm sorry. You could have just told me. So, anyway, thank you. So anyway, let me talk about something else for just a couple of minutes, a subject I wasn't going to talk about. Somebody brought this up at dinner. I was going to talk about COVID and what happened there. And, the reaction to COVID was this weird reaction where it was not a public health reaction. It was a militarized and monetized reaction. And it happened all over the world at once. All these liberal democracies suddenly pivoted and imposed these totalitarian controls, which were irrational, that were not scientifically valid, that, had been discredited, et cetera. Lockdowns, and they went after, of course, to keep us from complaining or talking about them or questioning them. They imposed censorship from day one. And, the founders, specifically Hamilton, Madison, Adams, said we put freedom of expression in the First Amendment because all the other amendments are dependent on it. Because if you give a government the right to silence their opponents, they now have a license for any atrocity, and they'll start getting rid of all the amendments. So what do? As soon as they could censor us, they went after the other part of the First Amendment, which is freedom of worship. They closed all the churches in the country for a year without any scientific citation, with no, regulatory process, no there's no. I've been suing government for 40 years for not doing public hearings, for not doing an environmental impact statement when they're going to, pass a regulation. They got to do an environmental impact statement and show the costs and benefits, who's going to get hurt. They have to list all the scientific studies. And by the way, you can do it in emergency and still be doing the environmental impact, still do the democracy while you're, locking people down if it's an emergency, but you can't stop the democracy. Then there's notice and comment rulemaking. So everybody gets to read it. They have to publish their proposed rule. They have to give people 60 or 30 or 90 days to comment on it. They have to respond to all those comments. So if somebody, if you're passing a mask mandate, and I own a kayak company, and I say if I make my clients wear masks, they're going to drown, you have to respond. The government has to respond. And they usually do it by saying, well, we're going to give you an exemption because you're outdoor, you're in the sun, we want you there getting healthy. But there was nothing like that. It was just everybody do it. And there was no notice and comment rulemaking. And then they go after the part 3 of the First Amendment, which is freedom of assembly, by making us all, social distance. And then they go after the Fifth Amendment property rights. They closed 3.3 million businesses with no due process, no just compensation. Just one guy who's been in there for 50 years saying, masks don't work 1 week, and 2 weeks later, everybody put one on. And it's just completely the definition of arbitrary and capricious. Not a single scientific citation ever for 2 years. And then they went after jury trials. Here's what the Seventh Amendment says. No American shall be denied the right of a trial before a jury of their peers in case their controversy is exceeding $25 in value. That's it. There's no pandemic exception. And by the way, the founders knew all about pandemics. There were 2 epidemics during the Revolutionary War. There was an epidemic that decimated the armies of Virginia with malaria. And then there was a smallpox epidemic that totally debilitated Benedict Arnold's army when he took Montreal. If it weren't for that epidemic, Canada would be part of the United States today because we took Montreal. But because they didn't have the manpower because of the epidemic, they had to withdraw. And between the end of the Revolution and the writing of the Constitution, there were at least 2 or 3 really serious epidemics every year: smallpox, yellow fever in all of our cities, cholera, that killed tens of thousands of people. So the founders knew all about epidemics, but they didn't put an exemption in the Constitution. So, and they, of course, they went after the Fourth Amendment, prohibitions against warrantless searches and seizures, and we all have to, give our medical information before we go into a bowling alley or a public building. Really, they got rid of every one of the first 10 amendments, except for the Second Amendment. It's the only one that was left intact. And, and so I looked at this and I said, how did this happen? Because it's not just happening here, it's happening all over the world. And that and the information in the last chapter of my book was to me the most shocking revelation. Because what I found was, I saw this Event 201. And raise your hand if you know what Event 201 was. Okay, for those of you who don't know, Event 201 was a pandemic simulation, a coronavirus pandemic simulation that took place in October of 2019. Nobody had ever heard of coronavirus till January. So that's 3 months later. In October, we now know that coronavirus was already circulating in September, so the month before, in Wuhan. But nobody knew about it. And yet they had a coronavirus pandemic simulation in New York City, hosted by Bill Gates and Avril Haines, the former deputy director of the CIA, who did all of the Guantanamo Bay cover-up. She is like the cover-up queen. And they do a simulation, and who else is there? George Gao, the head of Chinese CDC. So, who obviously knows the coronavirus is circulating. He is the world's coronavirus expert. He's also the head of the CDC in China. And then they had all of the social media platforms were there, the big insurance companies, Johnson & Johnson, the big pharma companies, and they meet for 2 days. And they have 4 seminars, and each one is faking this, coronavirus is spreading across the world. And they simulate, they don't say, okay, we got vitamin D to everybody, and we got to make sure everybody gets exercise and gets out of their house and gets healthy and, builds their immune system. And there's none of that. And zinc and, all the things. We got to figure out early treatments. We got to use the computer, the internet to connect all 15 million doctors, frontline doctors around the world, so that we know when they treat people what's working, what's not, and we're constantly upgrading the protocols. That's what they should have been doing. That's not what they were doing. They were working on ways to use the coronavirus pandemic as a pretense for clamping down totalitarian controls globally. And, they talk about in some of these concentration camps and all of this stuff. But here, the last simulation on the 4th day, George Gao and Avril Haines from the CIA are talking, they have a soliloquy about how do we clamp down to stop people from saying this came from a lab leak. So they're saying that. This is in October of 2019. And they say, well, we got to get the social media companies to censor them and deplatform them and all this. You can go on YouTube and watch this tonight. It's called Event 201, and this is the 4th section of it. Oh, and people knew about that, you know, who were looking at this like me. And from almost the beginning, but then I started doing a deep dive when I was writing the book. And I found out that was not a one-off. And I describe in that book, I found about 20 of these that they had been doing since 2001. And they're all scripted by the CIA. And all of them include top-level officials like James Woolsey, the deputy director of the CIA, Tara O'Toole. All of them have senior CIA officials. Many of them have famous people who kind of give an imprimatur of legitimacy to what they're doing, like Madeleine Albright or Tom Daschle or, you know, Bill Gates at a lot of them, and Gro Brundtland from, from the WHO. People who are respected, and they end up drilling, each one of them is drilling the imposition of totalitarian controls. Collectively, they have names like Dark Winter and Crimson Contagion and all these weird names, but collectively they're called Operation Lockstep. And they involved hundreds of thousands of people, public officials from little towns all over America, health officials from the state, police, firefighters, hospital systems, public utilities, and FBI, CIA, US Marshals in Canada, the United States, all over Europe, Australia, and China. They were all doing it together, drilling, here's what we're gonna do when a pandemic comes. And a lot of these people, you can see, are surprised about what they're doing. But they're probably looking around and saying, well, everybody else thinks this is okay, so I guess this is what we do when the pandemic comes. So they drilled people in doing something that was clearly contrary to their values, but it got them all teed up to do it and do it all at once and say, this is what you do when there's a pandemic. The first thing you do is you end freedom of speech and you start gutting the Constitution. So, you know, I look back on, in my new book, I talk about the history of the US bioweapons program. And from the beginning, the CIA was running the bioweapons program. Why? Because we didn't have a bioweapons program after World War II. And the CIA's first operation was called Operation Paperclip. And it was an operation to get all the bioweapons and nuclear and chemical scientists out of Germany and Japan, where they had an extensive bioweapons program. The Japanese had a horrendous program where they did live vivisections on 3,000 people. You know, they killed them all during the operation, removing their infected organs while they were alive with no anesthesia. And these were horrible, horrible scientists. The CIA elevated them, brought them over to Fort Detrick, downloaded them, and made them the heads of hospital systems and pharmaceutical companies in Japan, and continued to work with them. And they brought all the German scientists over here. And then they did all these experiments unwittingly on the American public. They sprayed toxins in National Airport. They sprayed them in the Pentagon air conditioning system. They put poison water in NIH. They put light bulbs filled with bacteria that they broke on the grates and contaminated the New York City subway system. Some of those microbes still in the subway today. They did aerial dosing and from ships of about 60 million Americans. They dosed San Francisco, Los Angeles, New York, Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia. All of the seaside towns were dosed from the air, and a lot of the Midwestern cities were also dosed. They're all unwitting. They did 200 outdoor tests on Americans unwitting. And they developed bioweapons by 1969 had a nuclear equivalent. They could kill people at 29 cents per death, according to a CIA study, which they're bragging about. And then in 69, President Nixon shocks the world by going to Fort Detrick and ending the U.S. bioweapons program. He was worried that we were creating bioweapons that could be reproduced for nothing. They were kind of a poor man's nuclear bomb. Anybody could reproduce them and we were publishing how you did it. So they were giving blueprints to foreign nations to create these things that could be used against us. And he said, why are we doing this? We have nuclear bombs. We don't need these things. And we have a monopoly on nuclear bombs. 7 nations have them. We've agreed not to give them to anybody else. Why are we letting these guys get, weapons that are going to be turned against us? So he shut down the whole program. The Pentagon destroyed all of its bioweapons, but the CIA went into Fort Detrick right before the Pentagon went in there and took cultures of all the different weapons and hid them in a warehouse. A lot of it was in New York City and Washington, D.C., and they continued. We signed the Bioweapons Treaty, which Nixon, one of the great accomplishments of Nixon, he got all the nations in the world to sign it. We signed the Geneva Convention finally after delaying it for 50 years. The CIA was breaking the law the entire time. Then, in 2001, in June, the CIA sponsors the first of its pandemic simulations. It simulates a biological attack on Washington, D.C. by Saddam Hussein. This is in June 2001. That simulation got international press, and a lot of the CIA people like Judith Miller from the New York Times was promoting it, going around doing all the talk shows. It triggered 2 Senate hearings, one by Joe Biden's committee, and that hearing was in September 2001. What happened in September 2001? The 9/11. So that hearing was going on during 9/11. As soon as 9/11 happened, the neocons, which were working on all this stuff with the CIA, pulled out the Patriot Act, a 350-page statute from a shelf where it had been waiting for a while, and in 1 week said, we want to pass this in a week. There's only one member of Congress who read it, which was Dennis Kucinich, and he went crazy and said, you have no idea this is the end of American democracy if you do this. It allows the CIA to spy on Americans. One of the things the Patriot Act did is it did not get rid of the Geneva Convention or the Bioweapons Treaty, but it said no federal official can be prosecuted for violating those 2 statutes. So it reopened the bioweapons arms race globally. And a week after, when the Patriot Act was being debated and it was being held up by 2 senators, there was an anthrax attack on the U.S. Capitol. It was blamed on Saddam Hussein, and the neocons all said, see, we were right in the pandemic simulation, Saddam Hussein attacked us. And we used that as a justification to go to war against Saddam Hussein. And within 2 days, we passed the Patriot Act. Who got the anthrax? 2 Senate offices. Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy, the 2 senators who were blocking the Patriot Act. The FBI did a 1-year investigation. They said this anthrax was unique. It was Ames anthrax, and there's only one place in the world it could have come from, Fort Detrick, the CIA lab. So we went to war, we passed the Patriot Act, and immediately started giving $2 billion a year to bioweapons development. The Pentagon didn't want to do it because it was nervous about the legality, because it was a death penalty to violate the Geneva Convention. Oh, you would have been committing a war crime, even if somebody told you it was okay. It wasn't. And so they funneled it through DTRA and DARPA. They funneled all of that money to NIH to NIAID, which became the primary spear tip of bioweapons development. So Tony Fauci became the bioweapons czar in 2001. His budget went up by $2.2 billion. He was personally given a 68% raise from the military. That's why he was the highest paid individual in the federal government, because he was getting this 68% bonus every year from the military. But it meant that he could not stop. And the thing the military wanted was gain-of-function studies, where they could take wild viruses and turn them into bioweapons. And bioweapons development always includes vaccine development, because unlike chemical weapons, with bioweapons, there's always blowback. It's called the boomerang effect. If you give your enemy bubonic plague, your guys are going to get it first, too. They're going to get it quickly. So the only way you can deploy a bioweapons is if you have already developed a vaccine. So the race is to develop a vaccine simultaneously with bioweapons, and then you can deploy the bioweapons, and your enemy will take a couple of years to develop the vaccine. And you can inoculate all of your team. So in 2014, 3 of Tony Fauci's bugs escaped from federal labs. And their escapes were public. And it caused a huge brouhaha. There were Senate hearings, and people were immensely upset. And 300 scientists wrote a petition to President Obama saying, you have to shut down Tony Fauci. He's going to cause a global pandemic. And Obama declared a moratorium and ordered Fauci to shut down the 18 studies he was then doing. And as I show in my book, he didn't do it. He instead took that science and he moved it offshore to the Wuhan lab and to the Ukraine. And when he did that, he was not the only one who did it. Tony Fauci spent about $29 million on gain-of-function science in Wuhan. But the CIA spent over $100 million. And the military spent about that much too, about $64 million. And the CIA funneled the money, most of it through USAID. But the CIA, as we now know, was also running this organization called the EcoHealth Alliance, which Fauci was funneling his money through. It was like a laundromat where they funneled federal money so that their fingerprints would not be visible on those studies. And so that's important to understand now. Just to get to the final thing, in my book, in Tony Fauci, if any of you end up reading the book, that last chapter talks about all of these pandemic simulations. I've been studying the CIA for much of my adult life. Because of my family's relationship, I wrote a book, which to me is my best book, American Values. And it is the story of my family's 60-year fistfight with the CIA, which began with my grandfather, Joseph Kennedy, who served on the Hoover Commission in 1955 and recommended the disbanding of the CIA's plans division. Its division that was fixing elections and assassinating leaders and all of that. So the CIA never forgave my family for that. And then when my uncle came in, after the Bay of Pigs, he fired the top 3 officials, Bissell and Cadell and Alan Dulles, who then made himself the head of the Warren Commission 3 years later. And when my uncle died, he told a reporter, I'm glad the little shit is dead. He thought he was a god. And so I know a lot about the CIA. I've gotten their manuals. I paid over $1,000 to get these manuals because they're training manuals from MK Ultra, and MK stands for mind control, MK Naomi, MK Dietrich. It all came out of Fort Detrick and NIH, and then 150 colleges around our country where they were funding these studies. And if you look at what they do in these simulations, they're using all of these techniques that they developed in colleges, in college laboratories, social scientists and other scientists, medical scientists for years who were studying how do you control individual behavior, but also mass behavior? How do you induce mass psychosis? How do you create Manchurian candidates? How do you do all these? They had all these colleges studying these, and how do you impose centralized foreign control on indigenous populations? By coming into a country, by using propaganda, by using fear, by sowing chaos, by destroying relationships, destroying faith in institutions, driving people apart and creating chaos so they will invite in an authority who will give them peace and safety. And all of these mind control techniques are designed to accelerate that process. And they study the Stockholm syndrome, for example. If you lock people, down, they become grateful to their captors, and they become angry at the people who criticize their captors, and they believe that the only way that they can escape this confinement is through total obedience and total compliance to their jailers. But one of the most interesting experiments was called anyway, I'll think of it. It was Milgram. And there was associate scientist at Yale, a sociologist called Stanley Milgram, who was part of the MK Ultra program. And he conducted this experiment where he recruited subjects from every walk of American life. There were students, there were professors, there were business people, there were blacks, whites, everybody from the New Haven area. And he would put the subject in a chair at a table where there was a dial in front of them that they could administer an electric shock to a person who was tied in the chair in the next room, who they told was tied in a chair, but he was actually a Confederate of Milgram's. He was an actor. And when they turned this dial up and administered the supposed electric shock, they could hear the man in the other room screaming, shouting, begging, struggling, pleading with them, crying. And most of the people who were participating in this experiment begged to stop. A lot of them were crying and telling the doctor was standing behind them saying, turn it up, turn it down, turn it higher, turn it down, turn it even higher, turn it down. And 67% of them turned it up to 250 volts where it was marked potentially fatal. 67%, and you can go on Wikipedia and look this up. The Milgram experiment. But 33% of the people got up and walked out. And what Milgram said, that for 67% of the people, if you have an authority figure that has some imprimatur of legitimacy, like a doctor's title, that 67% of people will take his orders, even if it means violating their most sacred values. They'll go against everything they believe in. And to me, it occurred to me many times during that 2020 that we were all involved in this huge Milgram experiment, and that Anthony Fauci was, Dr. Milgram, telling us you can violate the Constitution, you can censor speech, you can close churches, you can shut businesses, you can ban jury trials, and you can, tell people what they can and can't do, and you can gaslight them and marginalize them and vilify them, and no cruelty is too great for somebody who disobeys. And what I would say to you is that 33% of the people walked out, and the people in this room are the 33% who wouldn't be told what to do. And what our job is now is to fight for the 67% till they wake up and till they're able to fight for themselves, to restore the freedoms that all of us believe in. And I'll leave you with 3 thoughts. One is that any power that government takes from the people, it will never return voluntarily. Number 2 rule, every power that government takes, it will ultimately abuse to the maximum extent possible. And number 3, nobody ever complied their way out of totalitarianism. The only thing we can do is resist. Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you all very much.
Mr. Kennedy has agreed to sign copies of his book, The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health, just out in the Searle lobby.